What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. This is going to be another video for the Tiermaker album ranking series, and this is another band that I really want to do for quite a while now, since that I have been interested to do some more album discography rankings through Tiermaker. So we're going to start things off onto something not metal related, but does involve some of my favorite bands, and this is going to be for ranking the albums with King Crimson's discography. King Crimson is one of my favorite bands of all time, and if Pink Floyd were not around, this band would have been my favorite in the progressive rock genre. I love Pink Floyd being my favorite prog rock band. I love others including Yes, but King Crimson obviously has been as influential and massively important in the progressive rock genre. So, as always, this is my personal opinion. You can have a list of your own. Please address your words and your list of album rankings in the comments down below. So let's dive into this. I'm not going to go into the lineup changes very much because I'm only going to talk about the albums themselves. So anyways, let's go into this. The first album, In the Court of the Crimson King, personally will have to put into the S tier. This is one of my top 10 favorite debut albums of all time. I absolutely do admire the sound of this. There was no other album like this before. And of course, there are earlier albums in the beginning scenes of prog rock, like Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues, and In the Court of the Crimson King is no exception. This has some very warm and big, yet modern sounding production that sounds as fresh, and the vocals onto this album were just one of the best points about it. Some emotional to really melodic and beautiful. The instrumentation goes in many frenetic ways to some pure beauty. 21st Century Schizoid Man to I Talk to the Wind, Moonchild. There's only 5 tracks to this album, but every consistency that this album follows, this really is one of the best prog albums of all time, alongside with Wish You Were Here to Close to the Edge, amongst many more. But I could really go on about this, but I have done an album review for this album, if you want to check that out, a part of my Classic Albums Revisited segment. So anyways, In the Court of the Crimson King, as mostly important by many King Crimson fans as the band's best work, that is going to be, I think, very difficult for me to accept. Although I do love the album, I think it may not be my favourite King Crimson album, but I still do love the album. Next album, In the Wake of Poseidon, I'm going to put this record in A. Some people do criticise the album being very similar and alike to the sounds from In the Court of the Crimson King, yet alone this album was in the making immediately after. I think that this is a very underrated album, but it does not follow as very consistently like the first album was. But take it for granted, there are some amazing tracks to this. Some of these instrumental passages of music on this album work just as very efficiently, and I do love a lot more of the material put together. There are still some of these complex arrangements and some amazing performances onto this album, but it doesn't really fulfill itself as much. And obviously you got the Cat Food single, which was pretty surprising for a King Crimson single. But I'll have to say that In the Wake of Poseidon is incredibly a very much near perfect album, and it has been one of my favourite King Crimson albums. Similar vein of production and tone-wise, the vibe of this album does deliver very, very well. However, I don't think it's like one of the classics for me in the King Crimson discography. Hence, I had to put this second album in the A tier. Still a very strong record. Next album is Lizard, with, to me, one of the coolest, most beautiful album covers of all time. I'm going to put this record in B. I think this is very, very good, and I was really in awe that Robert Fripp cited this as unlistenable, and I do not agree whatsoever, yet he's one of my favourite musicians of all time. But I think Lizard is where I think the beginnings of the differences for King Crimson starts to take various ways of shapes. I don't think it was like as a stronger album like the debut or in the Wake of Poseidon, but there's still a lot of stuff to really absorb and admire to this. And surprisingly, John Anderson of Yes appears on one of the tracks, which was something I did not know about. But I think this is a very, very good record for what it is, especially onto some more of the influences that later on the sound of King Crimson decides to expand along the way, and especially with Robert Fripp as a musician. So Lizard, for me, is like a really good follow-up to the second album, but not as like one of the very best. But I am very curious if there are any King Crimson fans who loves this album, would maybe put this in the S tier or maybe in the A tier. So let's go into the fourth album, Islands. This is an album that I think is very overlooked, and I personally love this album. The more I listen to this, I absolutely admire the sound of this record, and call me crazy, but I'm going to put this in S. This album is, without any shadow of a doubt, maybe the very underrated album in the Crimson catalogue. There are some parts of this album that I find to be incredibly meditative and beautiful at the same time. And I know some people may take the offence of Ladies on the Road, which is like the weakest distraction for many on this album, but I love a lot of this album. You got Formentera Lady to Sailor's Tale, which is one of my favourite King Crimson instrumentals. And there are some parts of this that remind me on something very classical inspired and very dark at the same time. It's so moody as well. It has some more atmosphere about this. There's a lot more space than complexity, and that's what I adore about this album. The album cover, though, for me, it does have a beautiful resemblance and presentation of what the music is. It's a pretty magical album, but I don't think it's like one of the best King Crimson album covers. But it doesn't really follow up Lizard for artwork as like massively. But really, musically, I think Islands does really have one of my favourite King Crimson songs of all time. And I think that this is a masterpiece. So I know some people don't really like this album as much as the previous three. But I am one of the people that do defend this album for the majority of it. So yeah, Islands to me is one of the underrated classics. Now the next album, Lark's Tongues in Aspic. For some Crimson fans would pick this as the best album in the King Crimson discography. But I love this record. I will put this in S. This is maybe my favourite King Crimson album, although there's one other Crimson album that would be in the S tier. But I love this thing. This is a really heavy at times album. It's percussive. It's experimental in that tribal drumming vein. And this does have some really destructive parts of the music. And there are some other tracks that involve some incredible imagery and melody. I think that this is another gem of an album. Lox Tongues in Aspic, the first part of the album, is just as a masterpiece, and as well as the last half of Lox Tongues in Aspic. But then you go to Easy Money, which is another highlight on the whole album. Some of the riffs that Robert Fripp does on this album were just absolutely distorted to make it like an aesthetic, brutal sound. So I could really go on about Lox Tongues in Aspic just because of how much I do adore this album. So I can understand why some Crimson fans would pick this album as their favourite. But that's not until the next album, Red. Lox Tongues in Aspic stays in the S tier. Now, this would be possibly controversial for some people. Most people would pick this album in the S tier. I would have to put this in A. I know that's a very massive shocker, but to me it's near perfect. You got some of the other heaviest sounds of music, especially onto the title track of Red, but then you hear some other incredible tracks like One More Red Nightmare, and to me the highlight on the album being Starless. Starless is for me one of the top 5 most intense but melodically gorgeous sounds of King Crimson music. I don't think it's as strong as Lox Tongues in Aspic. However, there's another album that I've just noticed that I didn't put in previously before I go into Red, and that's Starless in Bible Black, which I'll go to next. I do apologize. But yeah, Red, to me, is a very strong record. I would personally feel the same way with my words, like with In the Wake of Poseidon. It's much more consistent than In the Wake of Poseidon. I think Lox Tongues in Aspic is a lot more favourable with me. And speaking of Starless in Bible Black, I'm going to put this record in B. Not really a record that delivers all consistently like Red or Lox Tongues in Aspic put together, but I think that there are some very underrated tracks onto this album. So I wouldn't really describe anything about this album in like an amazing amount of music, but I know that there are some people that love this album and defend this, and maybe put this in as one of the best ones. I really like this album very, very much, but I think with some of the material, it has a bit of a lacking moment. That there's something not as perfect in its own ability, like the ones that I put above. Some complexity here and there, but Starless and Bible Black is very, very good as a record, but I'm just one of the people that picks the ones before and later better. So that's that one. I know it's Starless and Bible Black, then Red. I do apologize. So I'm just going to leave this whole thing in. So anyways, after the 70s period of King Crimson, we go into the new wave, progressive poppy kind of vein, with multiple different sounds that are totally different to what Robert Fripp had wanted to think about with the earlier albums. But this is where, in my opinion, Robert Fripp goes into something very artistic. Let's go into the trilogy from Discipline, Beat, and Three of a Perfect Pair. Discipline is a mad, obsessive record with me. I love this album, and I'm going to put this album in S. This is, to me, the last classic album in the King Crimson discography. This production is just as brilliant. It's wonderful. It has a clean tone. you hear some of the most frenetic bass work you'll ever hear from one of my favourite bass players of all time. The vocals on this album were just one of the greatest I've ever heard, especially through a total difference of lineup change and musicality. Elephant Talk, Frame by Frame, and Discipline, just every single song on this album, just very rhythmic, kind of reminds me on a bit of Talking Heads-ish kind of vein, like with Remain in Light. Some of the vocals remind me of David Byrne, believe it or not. But I absolutely adore so much onto this album that no wonder some Crimson fans pick this as another masterpiece. This is an album that I prefer over Red, to be honest with you. However, in terms of my favourite King Crimson album, out of the four, it could maybe be either Lark's Tongues in Aspic or Discipline. I know I would put In the Court of the Crimson King as my number one, but it's such a very difficult record to pick as my number one, which is my number one out of the four, involving Islands. But I love so much about the massive imagery and the creative, adventurous direction of Discipline. So Discipline is a record I could really go on about. And recently it celebrated its 40th anniversary, and to me that has aged massively well. Anyway, moving on from Discipline, moving on to Beat, the follow-up. I am one of the people that loves this too. I don't think it's as near perfectly like a classic album like the other ones in the S tier, but I will put this in A. I don't care what anyone says. This is one of my favourite King Crimson albums. There are some parts to this album that delivers the continuation onto the new wavy sound, poppy, dancey, flowing type of beat. Yeah, dare I say that word. But I love the more basic vibes onto this album. Not as complex like the Discipline album, but there's so much beauty of this album that I really do like a lot. Heartbeat, and some of the other tracks combined almost flows naturally, as very consistently. I really like this album so much that this is one of my major high favourites in the King Crimson discography. Say what you say about this album, but I think that Beat follows Discipline incredibly, perfectly. As a matter of fact, I think that this album cover, being very basic, is to me another one of my favourite King Crimson album covers. Strangely reminds me of like a Windows 95 or a Windows 98 generated computer art. Very weirdly spoken of that, I know, but yeah, Beat is an awesome album and always one of my favourites. So now we're going to go into the last one in the trilogy, Three of a Perfect Pair. This is not, to me, like a really strong follow-up to Beat, but I really like it, so I will put this in B. I think that it does not deliver so well like with Beat or Discipline, but it does have some really good vocals, and I think that the last track of another sequel to Lark's Tongues in Aspic does have a difference in tone and production, and especially with the difference of safer-ish, I don't know if that's the right word, more of the basic structure like on Beat, but I don't like it as highly. That's all I'm saying with that. But it's still a really good album. So anyways, with Three of a Perfect Pair, it stays into the B tier. The next album with Thrak, the only 90s album from King Crimson. I would put this in B as well. For me, I think Thrak is another underrated record. Yes, there are some tracks that, for me, are not perfect or like top-tier King Crimson songs, but amazing production. There are some really, really good attacking, smacking drum sounds to some heavy guitar work. And I like that King Crimson are still bringing in some more diversity. Well, Robert Fripp, really. There are some tracks that I think were really, really overlooked, as well as with tracks from Beat and Starlet and Bible Black. Not a lot to really describe about this album. It's more of the return into the progressive rock kind of aspect. But with the earlier albums, they were definitely more admirable and deserved in the defining part of the band's instrumentation earlier on. So Thrak is one of those albums that I would recommend to check out in terms of the later era of the discography. So we're going to go into the construction of light. Unfortunately, this is to me the weakest in the King Crimson discography. And I can see why, because most people don't agree with a lot of the stuff onto the album. And even with the album cover, I don't like it. Robert Fripp accepts this as the album cover. I've seen that there were 3 other album covers for the album that were better than this. But anyway, as an album, sadly, I'll put this in C. I just don't think this is a really consistently memorable or a driving to addictive album. Yes, I find some of the tracks do feel very weird and unusual to dive into. However, it does have some moments, but there were some points of instrumentation that does not follow as equally, and for me it does contain the weakest material in the band's discography. But I really do admire what Fripp and company wanted to make with this, but as an album it's not very good. It doesn't have the equal amount of balance or just a really good amount of tracks. So it's not a bad album, it's just some very average material. It's at the same time very forgettable. That's another thing that I don't like about the album. It doesn't flow. It does not flow. It's sometimes unusual to the point that it's making me think that I don't agree with some of this. But yet again, I do respect the idea. The Construction of Light, to me, is one of those albums I could really do without of listening to, basically, in the discography. So we are going to go into the final album. I think that this will always be the band's final album. The Power to Believe, the second album from the 2000s era of King Crimson. The Construction of Light was released in 2000. The Power to Believe is thankfully an improvement, way more than the Construction of Light. I'm going to put this in B. This is more onto the heavier side of the band, and some would say that this is arguably the only progressive metal oriented album. I really do agree with that, because there are some of these musical arrangements that it does have some of Fripp's heaviest guitar riffs, and this built in quite a lot of the dramatic vibes of the lyrics and the vocals here and there. Some of the music does reflect on a bit of like a Red kind of aspect, although not as strong as Red, obviously. But The Power to Believe, as the final album for King Crimson, is a very good send-off. Not a masterpiece, obviously, not one of those gems, but to me, it's very accessible. It follows some more paths into something deeper, a bit more darker than usual. Power to Believe for finalizing the King Crimson discography, I think was a very acceptable album to conclude it. And I doubt that there will be another King Crimson album because, I mean, it's been almost 20 years since this album was out, and I don't think Robert Fripp and many more different lineup changes in the band's discography and career at the same time would make another album to follow up this one. So the Power to Believe stays in with me for the B tier. So that is it, guys. That is my video for the King Crimson discography Tiermaker album ranking. Do you agree with most of my picks or some? Like I said earlier, please address your list into this ranking in the comments down below. Do you think that King Crimson is one of the best bands of all time? Because I do love this band's work of albums, especially with a lot of the works of albums that are onto my ranking from the A and S tiers. And Robert Fripp is one of the greatest musicians and guitarists of all time, in my opinion. I admire his work. He's very adventurous, non-predictable, and mysterious, creative, and original musicians at that, as well as the multiple bassists, drummers he has worked with, and many more throughout the band's discography. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.